Hello everyone, Dr. Polaris here. Having already covered the famous diplodocoids, it was only a matter of time before I got round to examining their similarly iconic sister lineage, the Nacronarians, which included the largest and tallest land animals to ever live, containing a highly diverse array of species that dwelt on all continents including Antarctica. Nacronarians possessed an array of very distinctive anatomical features that clearly set them apart from their diplodocoid cousins. The most notable of these were prominent nasal openings that were placed high up on their skulls, a trait that gave the clade its name, meaning big nostrils. Indeed, the enlarged nares were often bigger than the eye sockets. Other typical Nacronarian traits included deep, wide-set skulls with expanded snouts equipped with robust, spoon-shaped teeth suited to processing tougher vegetation, broad voluminous torsos supported by pillar-like limbs, and cervical vertebrae that were shorter and stronger than those of diplodocoids, supporting necks capable of elevated and mid-level feeding. Nacronarians would become the dominant sauropod lineage from the late Jurassic until the end of the Cretaceous, achieving a global range, although the clade probably originated in Gondwana, with the oldest members of the group being an as yet unnamed genus from the Middle Jurassic Kadir Formation of Gujarat in Western India circa 170 million years ago, as well as the thankfully better understood genus Ceratocaudia, also from Middle Jurassic Gujarat. This was an oddly small animal that measured up to 7 metres or 23 feet long, despite the holotype representing a fully grown individual, in fact being one of the smallest known Nacronarian sauropods. Other early and basal members of this clade include the genus Abrosaurus, from the Middle Jurassic Dashanpu quarry of Sichuan province, China, between circa 168 and 161 million years ago. Interestingly, this was another very modestly sized Nacronarian that reached just 9 metres or 30 feet long, which perhaps indicates that Nacronarians originated as quote-unquote small and somewhat marginal sauropods, in comparison to the then species-rich and often very large contemporary Mamenchisaurids. Abrosaurus is also notable in that the holotype specimen preserved a semi-complete skull, which is a rare feat among sauropod fossils, with the skull in question being rather boxy and topped with a tall bony arch that contained the nostrils. Later Jurassic basal Nacronarians were somewhat larger animals, such as the recently described genus Brachiosaurus. Native to Argentina roughly 157 million years ago, Bibcode measured up to 15 metres or 49 feet long, and may have been a brachiosaurid, although its phylogenetic position within Nacronaria is not stable. Meanwhile, the late surviving early Cretaceous Aragosaurus was endemic to Spain, and was the first non-avian dinosaur to be formally described from the country, being up to 18 metres or 59 feet long, and known from relatively complete remains. Like other basal members of the clade, Aragosaurus would have had a relatively stocky appearance, with a moderately elongated neck and a square-shaped skull equipped with large broad teeth that were well adapted for browsing on the leaves and branches of tall coniferous trees. However, by far the most famous basal Nacronarian was Camarasaurus, from the late Jurassic Morrison Formation of Western North America. With a name meaning chambered reptile, this genus was the most common dinosaur recovered from the formation, and is subsequently one of the best understood of all sauropods, being represented by at least 530 specimens, including about 50 well-preserved partial skeletons. A very successful and long-lived genus, ranging between 155 and 143 million years ago and producing 4 species. Camarasaurus possessed a stocky build with a wide torso, comparatively short vertically oriented neck, and a robust, steadily constructed skull that was notably quite large by sauropod standards. The teeth were also large, forward-pointing and spoon-shaped, which, in combination with the animal's short, rounded muzzle, indicates a selective browsing niche. Given the adult size of the most common species, C. lentus, which was about 15 metres or 49 feet long and roughly 12 metric tons on average, Camarasaurus likely consumed the leaves and branches of ginkgos and conifers, while feeding at heights of between 7 and 16 feet. In addition, the skulls of these animals possess notable muscle attachment points that suggest the presence of a large coronoid process and masticatory muscles, giving this genus a far more powerful bite than other contemporary sauropods. A 2016 study by David Button et al. Estimated that the bite force of Camarasaurus was almost 4 times higher than that of Diplodocus, being highest at the rear portion of the tooth row, which could reach up to 1,978 newtons. Due to this, the genus underwent a relatively rapid tooth replacement rate, although was still notably slower than that of Diplodocus, likely due to the almost total lack of grit and soil ingested by this browsing sauropod. Due to the incredibly high numbers of specimens attributed to the genus, distinct gracile and robust morphs have been identified, which may possibly represent the remains of males and females, or perhaps different populations. Additionally, specimens representing the remains of both embryos and young juveniles have been identified, with a minute premaxilla uncovered at Dry Mesa Quarry in 1994 found to have belonged to an embryonic Camarasaurus that would have measured just 1 metre or 3 feet 3 inches long, and weighed about as much as a large domestic cat. It's since been estimated that the spherical egg in which this baby was contained may have measured roughly 24 centimetres or 9.4 inches in diameter, which is tiny in relation to the size of the mother, being a trait typical of sauropods. Adults, on the other hand, could potentially have lived to around 40 years of age, which is relatively old by non-avian dinosaur standards. In life, these would have been slow-moving but highly active animals with high internal body temperatures of between 36 and 38 degrees Celsius, or up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with large bite marks on their bones suggesting at least scavenging and possibly active hunting by big theropods such as Allosaurus and Torvosaurus. There were 4 species of Camarasaurus, with C. grandis and C. lentus being the best known, and were roughly the same size at about 15 metres long and weighing 12 metric tons or so on average, while large individuals could reach at least 16.5 tons. Meanwhile, C. lewisi was the smallest species at around 13 metres on average, although several specimens attributed to it were notably quite a bit smaller than this despite being fully grown adults. The type species, C. supremus, was also the youngest and most massive form, but is represented by fairly scrappy material, with lengths for this animal generally hovering around the 18 metre or 59 foot mark, while weight estimates placed this species at 23 or 24 metric tons, although larger sizes have also been suggested. A broader family Camarasauridae may have also existed as well, containing animals such as the Portuguese Lourinhãosaurus and the Argentinian Tehuelchesaurus, although the exact classification of these genera is not certain. All more derived Nacronarians were members of the clade Titanosauriforms, with one family in particular being especially famous and well known, the Brachiosaurids. These very distinctive and quite majestic looking sauropods first appear in the fossil record circa 160 million years ago, and possessed a number of immediately recognisable anatomical features. Like all Nacronarians, the forelimbs of Brachiosaurids were longer than the hind limbs, although this trait was notably more exaggerated than in other forms, which led to these animals having steeply inclined, high-shouldered backs. Their limbs were very sturdy and pillar-like, with the humerus or upper arm bone being either the same length as or longer than the femur. The neck was elongated and held at a rather upright angle of around 45 degrees, enabling Brachiosaurids to browse on vegetation close to the tops of trees that was generally out of reach for other sauropods. In contrast, their tails were comparatively short relative to their massive high-slung bodies. While renowned for being enormous earth-shaking animals, potentially the most basal member of the family was the comically small genus Europasaurus, from the late Jurassic of northern Germany, between 154 and 151 million years ago, dwelling in what was then a subtropical island archipelago. Europasaurus was a good example of the process of insular dwarfism, with the animal reaching just 6.2 metres or 20 feet long, and weighing somewhere in the range of 750 to 2,100 kilograms, making it one of the smallest sauropods to have ever lived. At about 11 feet tall, this genus would have been a selective browser that fed on the leaves and branches of Araucaria conifers and ginkgos, inhabiting the same kind of niche as their much larger relatives, despite representing a highly miniaturized endemic population. similar to the dwarf elephants and hippos that inhabited the Mediterranean during the Pleistocene. Meanwhile, the type genus for the family, Brachiosaurus itself, was a far larger animal, indeed once being considered the most massive dinosaur to have ever lived, before the description of the gargantuan South American titanosaurs such as Argentinosaurus in the 90s. First described by paleontologist Elmer Riggs in 1903 on the basis of a relatively well-preserved subadult holotype specimen. Brachiosaurus altithorax was a contemporary of Camarasaurus in the late Jurassic Morrison Formation. Unlike that animal, B. altithorax was a much rarer genus, with remains attributed to it being pretty scarce aside from the holotype individual, formerly known as FMNHP25107. This specimen consisted of dorsal vertebrae, in addition to a sacrum, 2 caudals, a rib, a coracoid, a humerus and a femur, hinting at a sauropod that measured between 18 and 22 metres, or up to 72 feet long, with weight estimates ranging from 28 to 46 metric tons. It should be noted that this specimen was not yet fully grown, meaning that adults would have been even larger. Like other members of this family, Brachiosaurus possessed a tall, high-slung body posture, with a sloping back and an elongated, upward curving neck that was held at around a 45-degree angle. The skull was also relatively tall, being equipped with a longer muzzle than the rather blunt-jawed Camarasaurus, while the teeth were comparatively large and demonstrated a high degree of complexity when set alongside those of other sauropods. This all suggests that Brachiosaurus was a high-browsing herbivore that fed on large quantities of ginkgos, conifers, tree ferns and large cycads, with intake estimated at 200 to 400 kilograms of plant matter daily in a 2007 study. Brachiosaurid feeding as a whole involved a simple up and down jaw motion. As in other sauropods, these animals would have swallowed plant matter without further oral processing, and relied on hindgut fermentation for processing their food. The teeth were somewhat spoon-shaped and chisel-like, being optimised for non-selective snipping, and the relatively wide jaws could crop large amounts of plant matter. Despite being a very famous genus, most pop culture depictions of this animal were based on the closely related and more completely known East African Giraffatitan, which was previously considered to have been a separate species of Brachiosaurus, B. branchi, native to the Tanzanian Tendaguru Formation at roughly the same time as its North American cousin, between 150 and 145 million years ago. This animal was, for many decades, thought to be the largest non-avian dinosaur. Most size estimates for Giraffatitan are based on the specimen HMNSII, a subadult individual that measured around 21 to 22 metres or 73 feet long, and stood roughly 12 metres or 39 feet tall, weighing somewhere between 23 and 39 tonnes. Larger specimens are known, however, although these are highly fragmentary, with one such example being the fibula HMNXV2, which was about 13% bigger than the corresponding bone in the subadult individual, perhaps indicating an animal that reached 25 metres or 82 feet long and weighed up to 48 tonnes. Giraffatitan differed from Brachiosaurus in possessing a more slender build, with greater adaptations for high browsing, a shorter torso, less robust forelimbs, and a more prominent nasal crest on the top of the skull. G. branchi was also far more common an animal at Tendaguru than Brachiosaurus was in the Morrison Formation, indicating that the former was home to ecosystems that were comprised of a greater diversity of very tall coniferous trees. Another close relative, Lusotitan, was endemic to what is now Portugal, and was the largest dinosaur present in the Lourinhã Formation, being of a similar size and proportions to Brachiosaurus and Giraffatitan. Members of this family persisted into the Cretaceous period, although all tended to be smaller and lighter than their Jurassic forebears, including the 15-metre or 49-foot Cedarosaurus from the Yellow Cat member of the Cedar Mountain Formation, Utah, dating to the Valanginian stage of the early Cretaceous, between 139 and 134 million years ago. This high-browsing herbivore was a contemporary of the large dromaeosaurid Utah raptor, the late surviving Turiasaurian sauropod Moabosaurus, and the ornithopod Hippodraco. Two other brachiosaurids were also found in the Cedar Mountain Formation, albeit in different members, with these being Abidosaurus and the relatively small Venenosaurus. which was one of the younger species of dinosaur native to this formation circa 112 million years ago. As of 2026, the title of youngest brachiosaurid goes to the genus Sonorosaurus, from the Albian to Cenomanian stages of mid to late Cretaceous Arizona, between 112 and 93 million years ago. This was one of the last North American sauropods to exist before the so-called sauropod hiatus, which saw the disappearance of these long-necked dinosaurs from the continent until the arrival of the Titanosaur Alamosaurus during the Maastrichtian. It's currently uncertain as to why the brachiosaurids underwent a general decline after the early Cretaceous, although a similar fate befell several other groups of sauropods that were once common and diverse during the late Jurassic, including the Diplodocids, Rebbachisaurids and Dicraeosaurids. This would leave members of the more derived Nacronarian clade Somphospondyle, which represented the sister clade to Brachiosauridae, to thrive and diversify across the Cretaceous period. These animals were so diverse and widespread that they deserve an entire video in their own right, and that's without even touching on the titanosaurs proper. However, I'll close off this episode by examining one basal and very impressive member of this clade, the gargantuan and epically named Sauroposeidon proteles. Native to what is now Oklahoma, Wyoming and Texas during the Aptian to Albian stages of the early Cretaceous, this enormous animal dwelt in lush river deltas that surrounded the Gulf of Mexico, being a contemporary of the famous Deinonychus and Acrocanthosaurus, which likely preyed on juvenile individuals. The holotype specimen for this genus was uncovered in the early 1990s, and consisted of 4 massive articulated neck vertebrae that were initially mistaken for pieces of petrified wood. It was originally classified as being a brachiosaurid, with most of the size and weight estimates produced for the genus being undertaken with this assumption in mind. However, more recent studies have found Sauroposeidon to have been a basal member of Somphospondyle, so these estimates may not be especially accurate. Regardless, this was a huge sauropod, perhaps reaching up to 34 metres or 112 feet long, and standing 59 feet tall, while weighing between 40 and 60 tons. Living in the lush tropical to subtropical ecosystem, with a climate comparable to modern-day Florida and Louisiana, Sauroposeidon would have been a high-browsing herbivore, and by far the largest animal in its environment, with its massive size being unusual for an early Cretaceous North American sauropod. The genus existed for about 3 million years, between 113 and 110 million years ago before going extinct, being one of the last North American sauropods before the aforementioned hiatus. Meanwhile, other more derived Macronarians persisted on the other continents, especially in Gondwana, where the titanosaurs would go on to produce a whole host of diverse species, ranging from the modestly sized armoured Saltosaurus to the largest terrestrial animals to have ever lived, such as Argentinosaurus. However, that dense subject is best left for a future video. Thanks for watching, everyone. The next episode will be covering the early evolution of modern type cetaceans that occurred after the extinction of the Archaeocetes at the end of the Eocene. See you again soon. Cheerio.